Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to the Tonic podcast. I'm Alex Kapitko, joined by my friend and co-host Drew Nepley. Drew, how you doing this week?
Doing fine, my friend. Doing fine. How about yourself?
Doing pretty well, man. Thanks for asking. So today I wanted to do a more in-depth touch and discussion about something we've mentioned a few times. I don't think it's any question to our listeners that we've talked about China a couple times. But today I wanted to dive deeper into the Belt and Road Initiative. It's something that we've touched on, I think, when we talked about Trump and China, when we've talked about the Uyghur situation. But I think it's time to actually talk about what it is, why it's happening, and what the repercussions of it could be. So for people that don't know, China's Belt and Road Initiative is known, according to Forbes, as a network of enhanced overland and maritime trade routes that are better linking China with Asia, Europe, and Africa. This began in 2013 when the Chinese president, I'll put president in quotes for obvious reasons, Xi Jinping announced this giant infrastructure plan. And it's really fascinating because this is looked to boost economic development in globalization's final frontiers. And when I'm talking about final frontiers, I'm talking about Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Africa, even polar routes towards the North and South Pole, the South Pacific, Oceania. It is quite impressive. And in some ways, this could be thought of as kind of a neo-Silk Road, which I think that's why this is so appealing to a lot of these Central Asian countries that have already been boosted by it. But the problem is that this focus is economic engagement and clever diplomacy. But it's very clear that this is also a very strategic or political action by China. And a lot of people are worried that in the long run, this is going to put a lot of poor nations in debt. So yes, this is a plan that is looking to provide infrastructure and communication. But it's very clear that this was also trying to put China at the center of the world. And a lot of people might have issues with that. So Drew, what are your first thoughts on this?
Well, first, I think to me it's abundantly clear that it's a long-term strategic and economic, plan, and that, of course, China has an excess of goods that they need to keep exporting, and they want to get rid of that. And there's the obvious economic benefits, but I do think politically and strategically, this is a long-term plan to kind of shift the globe towards Asia and prop China as the number one influencer on the world. I think it's Xi Jinping. This is his legacy. This is his life legacy, and this is what he wants to be remembered for: is the massive infrastructure building across the Belt and Road, right, across the maritime Silk Road, as he calls it, right, using new naval ports in Southeast Asia, and benefiting countries like Pakistan immensely. As well as the new Silk Road and the economic belt to across the Middle East to Europe and Africa. I think it's his. He sees that there's a window, an opening. Right, the United States is becoming more isolationist. The United States has not necessarily focused on parts of the Middle East and Africa as far as economic development. I think Xi Jinping sees an opening where China can start to become the next hegemony through this Belt and Road, and he's willing to put trillions of dollars on this. Right, this is not $1 billion project. This is $1 trillion. This is a $4 to $8 trillion project. So it's an immense amount of investment. And it seems like, at least in the last 5 years, that it's beginning to work. A lot of I think we had it here that it was something like 136 countries have signed deals with China, including 12 international organizations. I mean, that's no small feat to get like over 100 countries to do anything, and they want the investment. The Philippines is now, shifting itself more towards China, away from the United States. Malaysia, Indonesia, it's the same thing. I think it's working, but we're also starting to see the negative side effects is that China is starting to exert some of its power. Sri Lanka couldn't pay its debts and had to give up a port to China. A country in Africa had to do the same. So we're beginning to see, look, hey, if you want to jump on the train for this economic development, get on. But you got to remember that China is the one conducting it.
Yeah, I think you touched on that well. But I think, for obvious reasons, it seems that the Belt and Road Initiative has been supported by countries who either have traditional and historic ties to China or other ones that seem to be kind of left out of the Western development of the neoliberal model. And I think that's why this initiative seems appealing and appetizing to countries in Central Asia and Eastern Europe and in the South Pacific and in South America and Africa, because these are countries that don't really have much to lose, need help with investment in infrastructure, and probably would like to find a large power to work with. Because I was skimming articles today from Tehran, China, Moscow, Malaysia, and others, and all of them have an optimistic view on it. And it's clear that these are countries that really don't have a lot of good things to say about the West in terms of their economic neoliberal model. And the irony of it, though, is that China is acting about this in a very similar exploitative way as the World Bank and the IMF treated many of these developing countries in the 1980s.
Right.
Very high financed loans, but with large debts that come out of it, and it's funny. So kind of a little background on it was soon after Mr. Xi presented the maritime component, the first place was in the Indonesian capital of Jakarta. He called this the 21st century maritime Silk Road. And this was a network of port cities in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, and the Mediterranean would then eventually tie in. But interestingly enough, The Economist was reporting, I guess, on Thursday this week, that already Indonesia is having large issues following through with this because basically they can't afford it. And like you were saying, also with Sri Lanka, the same thing happened where they had to give a port, and the same things have happened in Eastern Africa. And another report comes out of the Philippines. You'd mentioned the Philippines earlier, and they're currently having an issue. Now, this was reported back in 2019, but Duterte's Chinese-funded dam, as the article calls it, is actually going to displace indigenous communities and is causing just an uproar of division inside of the Philippines, because this dam is being funded by the Chinese, costs about $232 million, and is going to pretty much provide water to the very drought-stricken Manila. But the problem is it's also going into sacred indigenous land and is going to displace, I think, thousands. And also it's very divisive, and many Filipinos don't support it. And so we're not only seeing a division inside of the Philippines over it, but we're seeing these strongmen use executive privilege to support China when the populations don't. And so while on paper, like you were saying, this is working, I think it's working for technocrats and for authoritarians who want quick fixes to their infrastructure. But I don't know still, and we've talked about this before, is I don't know if China is still winning the soft power. Yes, they're giving hard money and hard infrastructure, but I still don't know if they're winning over the people.
Well, that's very true. And what I meant by working, I just meant that a lot of people have signed on. Like their strategy to get people to sign on has been working. The long-term effects, though, I think are still up in the air. And you bring up a good point that it might be working for the business owners and the technocrats that are signing the deals, and the governments that are allowing the loans and to signing the deals. But the people may have a different opinion. Another good example of that is Hong Kong. Hong Kong is actually a pretty major part of this Belt and Road Initiative, and is currently having serious political turmoil. And many of the youth and the people protesting are kind of want to align themselves more with the West instead of China. I think China is so intent on keeping Hong Kong, Chinese, because its importance in their long-term economic plans and its importance in the Belt and Road. So it's not like, I think the Economist had put it right. There's already turmoil in heaven, right? Because on paper, China's promoted that this is going to be great for everybody, but we're already starting to see some backlash from the people that have signed on, from the people underneath the governments that have signed on. You're absolutely right. But I do think it's fair to say that. China, I think China will gain influence in countries that are less than morally less than morally high ground. I think, like, for example, basically what my point is that China, it does not care about human rights violations when they start dealing with who they're adding to this Belt and Road Initiative. That's something that the U.S. does keep in mind. Historically, it's been a little gray, but overall, more so than China, the United States is concerned with human rights violations a little bit more when we talk about who we deal with economically. China is less so, and they're willing to sign on dictatorships, in the Eastern Europe and in the Middle East that have no human rights. They're willing to add them onto the list and hop them onto the train. And I think that the opening, China's more open to who can come in. There's a mentioning in the that the Philippines, right? One of their prime ministers or whatever was talking to Vox, and he was basically saying that if you called the Washington D.C. to try and get on the line with Trump, you're going to get a different person every time, and you're never going to get through. Whereas if you call China, they'll talk to you. They might make you sign a big loan, but they're at least willing to talk and to deal with you. The United States is kind of in a weird isolationist, and with our tariffs, we're not as open to talk to people right now, especially developing countries, and especially developing countries that have human rights violations. China's willing to play ball with anyone.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really good point right there. As it's true, the U.S. the U.S. domestically is open for business, but we kind of have a sign that says closed temporarily to foreign trade right now. And that's not a good look if you're a country that needs FDI, which is foreign direct investment, right?
Right.
And so The Economist also, that same article that we've been citing a little bit here, I think had an interesting point, because I think us as Americans kind of think of this Belt and Road Initiative as a very nefarious anti-Western plan that is kind of looking to rally UN support and against us. But the interesting point is that I truly think that this is going to succeed in booming Central Asia and building Central Asia. I mean, I think Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, yes, they are going to actually succeed out of this, but those farther reaches are yet to be seen, because there are trade, legal disputes, and technology disputes inside of Germany, Spain, France, United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, all over Chinese tariffs, Chinese technology, and Huawei. And so I don't know, because the problem is The Economist says the harshest criticisms come from the incumbent superpower, whose global dominance the project is challenging. America's national security strategy claims that the BRI, that's the Belt and Road Initiative, is predatory economics. To borrow money from China is to fall into a well-laid trap. In December, Adam Bowler, the head of the new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, told the Financial Times that China's overseas investments were 100% like a house of cards because of heavy debts, badly built infrastructure, corruption, and a lack of transparency. The Economist says that this is an overstatement. They say certainly China applies dodgier lending criteria than do members of the Paris Club of major sovereign lenders, but they say that China actually has no nefarious master scheme, and that is part of the problem of them actually making this work. And I think it's a fair point, is that while they do want to expand their legitimacy and expand their clout, there's almost a lack of a centralized nefarious plan. I think they just want to find the common bidder, like you said. I think they want to talk to anybody. And because they want to talk to anybody, it's hard to have a concrete black and white plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about that. Like, it has been mentioned, right, that it is kind of vague when they talk about the Belt and Road in these speeches, right? There's obviously, you can look at, proposed gas lines, oil pipelines, and railways, and they've already built some of that. So there's, there is concrete things happening, but as far as a centralized plan, it is kind of vague. You're right, but I also think that they're also just casting a wide net, right? Like they're casting a very wide net, and they have to expect that not everything will come back, right? You're gonna have problems. You're gonna have countries that fall into war, and then your railway is gonna get cut off. Well, you're gonna have to adjust. They you know what I mean? They have to be able to understand that it's not all gonna just come into place easily. I do also think that like you said, I think there will be a significant economic boom because of this, and I think that it will benefit a huge amount of people. The question is, at what cost for your sovereignty, right? One of the main problems Malaysia had as they were trying to build high-speed rails in Malaysia, was they were bringing in Chinese steel, Chinese construction companies, state-owned construction companies, and the big one for Malaysia was it was all Chinese workers. They were just bringing in the workers. So Malaysia was like, hey, when does Malaysia get kind of the benefits of this? Yeah, we want the high-speed rail, but we would also like a say in building it, and we'd like to have our workers work on it. And it took a few years of talking for China to actually kind of admit, all right, we'll allow for more Malaysian workers. I thought that was significant that China actually gave up some of its power, but kind of, but still ended up finalizing the deal with Malaysia. But it just shows that China has kind of an open phone, right? Malaysia had a concern about it needed more Malaysian workers, and they listened. I thought that was really interesting. So that kind of goes to your point that it's not all nefarious, right? It's not all China clamping down on power, but they are kind of looking for major economic development, and maybe long term, giving Malaysia a little bit here, well, maybe Malaysia scratches China's back later on. It could be some of that as well. But I thought it was very significant that they actually listened to Malaysia's concerns, and maybe other countries will start doing the same.
Right, and I think that's another really good point. There is that I don't think this is anything, say, like the American-Russian Cold War. No. At the end of the 20th century, where there's a clear opposition of ideas that are going at each other. I think this is China more trying to export their system more than their ideas, because I think a lot of people don't understand. And inside of China, they've kind of given up some independent liberties and have signed a social contract with the government that says as long as you provide us with protections and jobs and healthcare, then we'll let you infringe on our independent civil liberties a little bit. And while the Wuhan virus is starting to, pressure that a little bit, I don't think China's trying to export that form of state-run authoritarianism. They're just trying to export more their clout and their economic might. And that is a big difference, I think. This is nothing like the U.S. and the Russia collide in the end of the 20th century. And I think China is willing to kind of evolve with which country they're talking to. I mean, Greece and Italy are just two of the EU countries that already have signed deals with China. And to me that is big.
Right.
Because these are now countries that, on one phone have Trump on speed dial and on the other phone have Xi Jinping on speed dial. And
right.
I think that's where you're seeing this interesting evolution, is because you're seeing countries that do support liberal democracies, but also like the idea of getting something in return. Like Greece is opening up one of their southeastern ports to Chinese trade. And honestly, in the short run, at least, it's probably better for both sides.
Yeah, it's certainly not the Iron Curtain of the Cold War, right? It's, in fact, I think it's the opposite of the Iron Curtain. It's opening up the curtains and trying to bring people in. And you're right. It's not about necessarily hard power, but like you said about Greece, on one hand, you have Trump on speed dial and China on the next. I think China's just trying to be the guy that's like, hey, you can call Trump, but we want you to call us first, right? We want to be in a position where if you had to choose between the two, you're going to call China first. It's not. There's no phone to the United States, and you have to call China, but we just want to be the guy you call first because we do more deals. We open you up more. I think that's the idea, right? It is strategic, but you're right that it's not like they're trying to create a block. They're not trying to block people out and keep people in. They are trying to expand their influence, and they're not trying to, not trying to make everyone communist. But I do think that it does have a long-term strategy of positioning China as the main economic and diplomatic power. And I think that's why, like you said, right, the major complaints come from the current hegemony in charge. I think that's why, right? The United States is like, yo, hey, we're getting shoved out. And unfortunately, I believe that our current administration is making that problem worse. I think we're allowing ourselves to get slowly pushed out of the top spot. I think we're still there. We're still in the top spot, but it's pretty obvious that China's creeping up. And this plan is going to help them do that, as well as open up a lot of developing markets to the world.
Yeah, and so now to kind of go off of that, I think the Trump administration, maybe not Trump himself, but the Trump administration, I think is starting to warm up to this idea and starting to be a little bit more precautious about it, because the New York Times reports that last Thursday, the Trump administration announced that it would begin talks for a free trade deal with Kenya. And this is a step partially designed to counter China's influence in Africa. And in quotes, the New York Times says that China has lent vast sums of money to African governments and built ports, roads, airports, and bridges, including the $4 billion railway in Kenya that is linked Nairobi and Mombasa. And the United States is hoping that they can start a new plan of some sort of economic Marshall Plan in Africa. And yet, this is yet to be seen. But my point is that I think the United States is starting to realize that we cannot let China sit back. And while part of me agrees with our trade war with China, I think it's almost the U.S. that in some ways has instigated somewhat of an East-West divide, more than China in this part. Because like you said, and I think it's a really good analysis, is that China does just want to be that person who's on every leader's speed dial. Yeah. And the U.S. is kind of saying, well, hey, if you don't talk to us, then I think you're going to have to block our number. And we'll see which idea wins in the long term, but I think the United States is still stuck in a black and white, like, economic Marshall Plan. Like, we need to develop this country so it's anti-communist. But China's kind of going, you know what? We don't need them to be communist or capitalist or democratic. We just need them to be our friend when we need them. And now this goes to my next point, though, which I think is worrying. And this is the digital Silk Road. Right. This is China's attempt at a 5G network. And let's be honest, but without any background, China's going to achieve this before anyone else does. And this is probably the most nefarious of it, is that they are going to become a cyber superpower. And I'm saying become, they have not yet, but their rush to a 5G network could change everything. And this is the most controversial aspect of the BRI. And this could pretty much change everything. And the United States, I don't think, has an answer to that.
No, we don't. We don't. I mean, even just our own internet is like miles behind some of the places you can get really good internet in like rural Belgium, better than you can get good internet in a city in the United States. And so that's already a bad sign. And yes, if China's with its own digital Belt and Road, and again, let's not forget that China's state keeps censorship on lockdown on their internet systems. So if they're establishing running sea cables to give high speed internet to developing countries, that also means that they're going to probably attach their security apparatus and anti-privacy apparatus on top of it. Right. So that comes with its whole whole plethora of human rights concerns. But yeah, I mean they're going to get 5G quicker. China's its own hackers do things across the world. Yeah, we're losing this battle as far as China's development, especially in the digital sphere. We're just losing this battle.
Yeah, there's an interesting article from The Economist out this week in the Schumpeter business section, and it says that American state capitalism will not beat the Chinese at 5G, and the argument is that obviously Qualcomm, right, is one of America's biggest tech firms. And they, under the Obama administration, were just berated with fees and trying to be broken up because of antitrust, anti-monopolist views, right? And so basically, what the Trump administration and the DOJ have been working on this week is somewhat of trying to build up Qualcomm in order to be kind of set out as the front man and the wingman of this fight for 5G. And so basically the argument is that America is actually trying to use state capitalism to fight China, because obviously that's what China's doing, is state capitalism. But the problem is, the argument is that America is so anti-trust and anti-monopoly that it could be hard to build up a company in the same way that China's built up some of their large conglomerates to put out Huawei. Because I mean, Huawei, let's be honest, it was the creation of an ex-Chinese general who has close ties to the party. And so he pretty much had all the technology, research, and funding at his disposal. And we just do not have that inside of the United States. And so while I actually support the DOJ, William Barr, and Trump's decisions on this, because I do think we do need something to combat it, and the only way to do so is through a large company that actually has the clout to do it, I just don't think the American capitalist private system can do it. And that's alarming, because we can build 5G, but I don't think we could do it with the reach that China is able to use.
Right. There is There is that benefit of having a state-run capitalist system where you can just tell companies what to do. There doesn't have to always be this, market research economic incentive. If the state-run company is state-run, then the state decides. Yeah, I want to give another example of kind of the reach of the digital Silk Road, right? A Chinese company run by their richest billionaire, Jack Ma, Alibaba, bought 83% of a Southeast Asian company called Lazada, which is kind of like an e-commerce site, similar to an Amazon or an eBay. And Alibaba owns 83% of it now. Now they have connections right now where they, on the Lazada website, you can basically portal to Alibaba. They're using Chinese warehouses now for their supply of the goods that are being sold. And so you can see that there's this combination of the actual ground infrastructure, Belt and Road, with the warehouses and the access to ports is going to also benefit the e-commerce now that Alibaba is now selling things on websites, not just outside of China, but into Southeast Asia, right? Because Alibaba made $23 billion in one day on their Chinese Black Friday. This is a massive company, and now that they're dealing with e-commerce in Southeast Asia, it all connects, right? It all connects to now you can be in a small town in Southeast Asia, click a button for a cheap Chinese product, and have it delivered to you in 2-3 days, like you would in the United States. That's a new thing in parts of Southeast Asia, but that's going to drastically change what consumers do and what suppliers do in that region.
That's a very good point, and I mean I think that goes back to the root of this is there's a huge untapped market in Central, South, and North Asia that is finally getting exposed, and just the population differentials are just unbeatable and uncomparable between the West and that part of the world, and as they are lifted out of poverty and agrarian societies, I don't know if there's much that anyone can do to combat it. And, I think that it's pretty much, very known that Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. have taken a firm stance against a lot of these Chinese corporations. And the Eastern Asia and Russia have obviously accepted them. But I think the battleground, in quotes, obviously not a true battleground, but the battleground is going to be in Europe, as we've seen, right? Because there's currently court battles going on in almost every EU country over whether to allow Huawei or not.
Right.
Also in also in Australia. And as I mentioned earlier, Greece and Italy are already open to Chinese influence. But so far, Germany, the UK, Spain, no, but and France have stood up so far to Huawei. But there's debates inside the parties, and it's not a right or left issue. It's kind of an economic issue and a principled issue, and I think Europe is going to kind of be the canary in the coal mine to see what happens next.
I think that's a really good point, especially when you have kind of the European Union kind of being weaker than it has in the past, right? With Brexit and kind of nationalist movements we've talked about in some parts like Hungary. Yeah, you're going to start to see kind of the cracks that China might want to fill, and not nefariously, again, kind of just like, hey, well, we'll deal deals with you. If you're having problems with the EU, we'll always be here. Again, it's just being that guy on the phone. That's a really good point. I thought the Economist article had a really good line when it said, we always it was something similar of we always thought that economically Europe would go to China, and in reality today it's China's coming to Europe. And that's right. It just shows that the economic center of the world is shifted east for the last 15 years. And that's a really good point. And it's only going to increasingly do so with the Belt and Road Initiative. And again, I want hundreds of millions of people to be raised out of poverty. We just have to be very careful about what people give up to do so, right? It could be human rights. It could be sovereignty. It might not be, right? We've seen that Malaysia is able to keep somewhat sovereignty, but they still have to pay their debts. I just think we have to be very careful about who's conducting this train, but I do think that the train needs to go full steam ahead because we need to bring people out of poverty.
Yeah, I'm just concerned what happens on the day when China comes to call for their debts.
Right.
And I'm not talking about only financial debts. And for me, the financial debts are pretty black and white. Taking a port is one thing, but what happens when there's a hypothetical conflict between, I don't know, China and India, because China and Pakistan are best buddies, and the Chinese need to send troops into Eastern Africa or into the Middle East. And now they can do so because they own all the new ports that they built and all the new shipping routes and all the new train routes. To me, there's just that nagging, nefarious side that why are they building all of this infrastructure? Because maybe one day they're going to want something out of it.
They definitely are. You're absolutely right. That's why I think to combat it is I think the United States need to start doing similar things with less of a nefarious purpose, not as severe of loans, and we wouldn't take a port, right? I don't think we would do that, right? That we shouldn't do that, but we do need to get on kind of the bandwagon of like, let's build like we need to be working more with South America as far as building economic blocks. And I know that we don't have many friends in places like Venezuela and stuff, but like I feel like the United States needs to kind of get on the same page as like, look, like the tides are changing, and we need to be more willing and working with the world and connecting people. Otherwise, we're going to get left out. And like you said, whenever China needs to come down to a serious vote in the UN or military conflict, it's going to get very complicated when 136 countries start siding with China.
Exactly. And I think we'll probably touch on this more down the road. I don't know if you have anything else to say, but I think it's been a good discusussion.
I think so too. And I think that I'm going to go buy some cheap Alibaba stoves and microwaves. No, I'm kidding. Thanks again, everyone, for listening to the Tonic Accord podcast. Let us know your thoughts on the Belt and Road Initiative. Is this a net positive or a net negative for the world? Do you think China has a dark, nefarious long-term plan, or is this simply to be a builder of infrastructure? Let us know what your comments. Find us on Facebook, YouTube, Podbean, Instagram, and we always welcome comments, and thank you for listening.